All right, welcome to the Gateway API community meeting for February 12th, 2024. Thanks to everyone that made it. If you don't mind adding your name here to the attendee list, that will help us keep track of what times work best for everyone. And also just a friendly reminder, this is a Kubernetes community meeting. So we abide by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which generally just means to be nice to each other. Uh, Please, keep that in mind, and also to make sure that everyone gets a chance to say what they want to say. I encourage you to use Zoom's raise hand feature just so that we can make sure we get to everyone. Um, yeah, I think that's it. On the note of trying to figure out what meeting times work best, next week we're planning to use the EU-friendly meeting time slot that we've been using for the first meeting of every month, but we're also planning to use that next week as well. The alternative would have been a meeting which would have been fallen on a US holiday, so probably would have gotten limited to no attendance. And we're hoping that we'll get more attendance, especially as we're leading up to KubeCon, also in EU, in just a month. Whenever it is, it's coming very quickly. So yeah, that's it. And with that, Shane, a couple comments about Contributor Summit.
Yep, they extended the Contributor Summit until Wednesday. So if you didn't get a chance to put in a proposal for the Contributor Summit for Paris, that is available for a couple more days here to get those in. So please do. Also, the Contributor Summit volunteer form is up. If you're going to be at the Contributor Summit and you have some time to volunteer, there are different levels of volunteering and it helps out tremendously. So if you please would check that out, see if there's something that you'd have some time to do, we'd appreciate it.
Cool. Yeah, I always look forward to Contributor Summit. It's certainly one of the highlights of KubeCon for me. So if you are going to be able to make it, but you're not sure if you qualify for Contrib Summit, don't hesitate to reach out. Chances are if you're at this meeting, you probably qualify. So we can help you get there. Yeah. With that, let's move right into gaps because we are getting awfully close to release of 1.1. We're still a month plus away, but we're at the point where we really need to figure out what is and is not in scope. And I think we have a reasonably good idea, but there's been a new gap that's gotten a lot of, I guess not new, but a gap that has resurfaced that has made me question some things. So just as a reminder, what we have right now is we've said that for every gap that goes out of experimental, we're creating room for one gap to go into experimental. And right now, what we're expecting to transition is conformance profiles, gRPC route, and route port matching. We're expecting all of those to leave experimental and go to standard in this release. That's not a certainty, but that's the trajectory we're on right now. So that opens up 3 spots, basically, for new gaps to come in. And based on previous meetings, I think we'd said, okay, session persistence, that seems like a pretty clear, likely candidate. We've gotten a lot of feedback, a lot of interest. That's high priority. And that also feels very close. Then similar, ARCO's PR or gap for client cert verification for gateway listeners also feels like it's particularly close. And then retries, nobody has even started on this as far as I know, but it is one of the most widely requested features that we've seen. And so this was kind of the third item that I remember talking about. With that said, as you probably can see from the agenda, there's been a lot of work recently on Dave's gap around gateway merging and a lot of renewed interest on that. And that means we have, right now, one more gap that people have interest in than we have room for right now. So this is really just meant to be an open discussion of, where the priorities lie. We don't need to come to a conclusion here. I just wanted to understand if I was correct in my understanding of what we were working towards right now. I note that right now, no one that I know of is working on retries. So if that's one that we don't want to get into 1.1, we can consider that. But I just wanted to start a discussion about what we consider most important for this upcoming release.
I think I can safely say that retries won't get into 1.1. Flynn and I have had some early discussions about it. I would love to work on it for 1.2.
Yeah, that's that seems very reasonable. Is it just because there are different variations of retries and it's hard to find portability across them? Is that the fundamental?
No, it's mostly been other things taking priority for each of us. So I think that there's
Okay.
actually a pretty clear path to some of that.
Okay.
Given that like there actually is some there's like some nuance, but there's some common ground in terms of the Envoy implementation having a similar way of doing things to Linkerd's implementation. So like I think there is a path forward. We just have to prioritize and make time for it.
Cool. I will bump that down to 1.2 then. If no one disagrees, that's very useful feedback. Okay. Are there other gaps other than gateway merging that and this is to be clear, this is not me saying that we should or should not get a gap in. It's just whether or not we should consider and review and spend our cycles on this. Just because a gap, shows up on this board, it does not mean it's auto approved for the cycle. It's just what we're spending our cycles on to focus on. Are there other gaps that are, top of mind that I'm missing here? Oh yeah, thank you, Candace. Yeah, back in TLS is great. It's exciting to see conformance tests in progress on this one. And I don't think this one will actually make a transition because it's just in soak time, but getting the conformance test will make it that much easier to move forward in the next release. And Mike's saying that gateway merging in particular seems to have largely resolved the problems it's created. I will be the first to say I have not spent enough time reviewing that, so I'm speaking at a very high level of if this is something that I should be focused on, or if there are other gaps that we want to focus on instead in this cycle. It sounds like so far the feedback I'm getting is that this is something that we are very interested in. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm really happy that folks are interested in this one. I do think it's a lot of use cases that it hits. And if if other folks are interested in pushing this forward, then I'm sort of happy to dedicate some review bandwidth to it. Yeah, as much as I would like to do more work on it myself, I just don't have the bandwidth. But I will make review bandwidth available if folks are interested in trying and pushing to get this in. Again, I think Rob is very correct to say that the agreement here is that we will all work on this and dedicate bandwidth to it, not that it will definitely make it in. Okay, just to be very clear.
Yep. And the other thing I just want to bring back to, top of mind here is that, when we talk to users, customers, anyone at KubeCon, the thing that does come up a lot is absolutely session persistence and absolutely retries. We're hitting one of those things. We aren't hitting retries. I understand it's a complicated thing, but I want to be cognizant of just, I personally have not had an end user request gateway merging. I see that there's a lot of value that it could provide, but it's not something that I've seen the same level of interest in from the end users here. Not saying we should or should not prioritize it. It's just one piece of the puzzle when we consider prioritizing something. But with that said, it seems like we have a good fit here. So for right now, I'll pencil that one in as something that we're targeting for that. I think, Dave, is this the right one, 1713?
Yeah.
Okay. we'll pencil this in for 1.1 and we'll make a best effort for this one.
I think like I've been resolving questions and comments as they come in. I think the standing threads are sort of just like open-ended questions on the issue. I'm not gonna bring it up now, but essentially that's why they're open.
I would recommend that even if we do have outstanding questions and they don't seem to be tractable to answer in comment threads, and this is a general thing, that it's 100% fine to merge them into the GEP as text in the GEP to say, outstanding questions or something like that. I mean, this is merging into like provisional, isn't it? I think.
I think so.
Yeah, so if it's merging into provisional, it's 100% fine for there to be like outstanding questions. What we are aiming to do here is agree, yeah, we want to like work more on this. Well, that's what provisional is for. And so like it's okay for there to be, we're not sure what to do about this, or this, as long as all of those things are recorded so that we come back so that in the next iteration we do something about it.
Yeah, and a pattern that I've seen in upstream Kubernetes when it comes to KEPs is using the unresolved keyword specifically, and kind of like highlighting a section, trying to capture the conversation, and then linking to a GitHub thread that has the full conversation. But definitely that's completely fair to merge something as provisional and then iterate on those individual questions, as smaller follow-up PRs instead of getting, once a PR has hundreds of comments, it starts to become really painful to work with. So that can make it a little bit more manageable and feel like you're making real concrete progress instead of just slogging through hundreds of comments. Cool. Okay. Speaking of GEPs, yeah, it looks like I've got everything else on this agenda. Feel free, anybody, to add things to the agenda, but I'll just keep on running through. Right now, this GEP is pretty broad in its name, but I think we ended up on on a more tightly scoped GEP in terms of what it actually does. So what this GEP is focused on is verifying that the certs served by a backend are correct, are valid, right? That's it. And there's another
I
part
think it's
of
more
MTLS.
ensuring that the gateway knows it needs to use some certs to connect or yeah.
Well,
The-
sure, but
it's
that part of
yeah. It's not. It's ensuring that the gateway knows that backend requires TLS is probably a better way to say it.
Okay, sure, I'll get that. But what it is missing by design and intentionally is a way to configure a client cert that should be used to connect to a backend. That's intentionally omitted from that, and a requirement if you are going to allow enable MTLS configuration between a gateway and a backend in a manual way. Obviously, there's ways to just automatic opt-in, whatever. But if we want to allow manual configuration of that, then we need somewhere to put a client cert from a gateway to a backend. And that's a long-winded way of saying that I created I left a comment here that I'm thinking we should very clearly scope this GEP on what it currently includes and then use follow-up GEPs that are, still covering the broader topic of TLS from gateway to backend, but maybe cover client cert from gateway to backend, for example, right? Instead of trying to just keep on adding things to this GEP and delay its eventual graduation to standard. Yeah, so does that sound fair? Okay, cool. So I can start a follow-up issue just to focus on that other piece of this, I think. There may be yet other pieces or other extensions that I may be missing here, but I just think that due to the way our system works, it's better to add follow-up GEPs than to try and continue to build on the existing GEP because that just delays how, when something can move forward. And I do think that backend TLS policy as defined is independently useful without any further additions. So
So yes,
Okay.
to be clear, I agree. And I think that this is going to be a good use case for the new extends state to extends relationships that are added recently for GEP relationships. So
Yes.
it'll be related and a further GEP will be related and extend this GEP. But I think that it's very likely that this GEP that an extension GEP will not extend backend TLS policy itself, because that's not the right place to put client config. And that's one of the reasons
agreed.
it's not in there now.
Agreed.
So
Yep. And then the very related, in my opinion, is if we're agreeing that at some point we want to configure the client cert a gateway uses to connect to a backend, then there's a decent chance that that configuration either belongs on or is attached to a gateway. Don't want to, that's at least a high probability. It's not a for sure. With that said, Arco has this client cert validation gap, sorry, which is great. And I've been meaning to do a more detailed review here. But one of the things I just want to be real careful with is that we have we have another thing that is client something inside the TLS block on gateway. And I understand, like, this is client validation. I think that's sufficiently unique here, but I just want to make sure we're leaving room to have a unique name whenever we add client cert. And we don't need to solve everything about client cert in this gap or along with this gap. I just wanted to have a picture so we're not, dealing with naming conflicts 6 months from now or whenever we choose to do the last bit of the MTLS from gateway to backend. So I know naming is complicated, etc., but this is just one area that I would love to get some thinking around this. Make sure that we've thought about the client cert implications, where that would live, how it might be configured, what we might call it. Would it be directly alongside this? I'm not sure yet, but yeah. Anyways, that's my main thing here. I think overall, this looks like a really compelling gap, but as I was looking at it, I just wanted to make sure we were all thinking kind of the longer term, bigger picture of how it fits into the rest of our TLS config. Yeah. Cool. All right. Oh, you know what? I said I was going to give a bunch of referential authorization updates. I am not well prepared for that. What I'll say is that if you care about reference grant, it really is moving to upstream Kubernetes, but it's a slow, painful process. There's a design review, API review on Thursday. If anyone's interested, you're welcome to attend. I can give you an invite or link to the agenda or whatever. With that said, reference grant is going to be split into a few different APIs that will go upstream. And these APIs are intended to not just cover the existing scope of reference grant, but also cover authorization, basically granting access to your controller. So basically instead of your controller having read access to all secrets in a cluster, your controller would only have access to secrets that were referenced from a gateway, for example. And similar for ingress, this is meant to be a very generic API because, as we found out, there are lots of different projects that are interested in something like reference grant, and they were using Gateway API for that, the Gateway API CRD. And yeah, it's not a great, not great to have everyone relying on Gateway API when Gateway API is very much a networking project. So we're working to push this upstream, but this means an entirely new authorizer in Kubernetes, a variety of new things. There's a few people working on this right now. I am one of them, but I'm not the only one. And so, yeah, I'll link out to the agenda and relevant KEP, and there's a proof of concept repo as well that I can link to. A couple hands. I think Candace, you might be first.
Yeah, sorry. Mine actually refers to the previous topic. So if you want to take questions for this topic first, that's fine with me.
Oh, great. Yeah. Dave?
It's kind of a question about how the case APIs is going to handle reference stuff, but maybe I can just ping you offline. It's like more.
Yeah, no, happy to answer anything. At a high level, because it's a generic API, you need to provide some awareness of where you can find the reference and how it's structured. So right now that's a JSON path. It might be a cell. This is not something that there's similar to Gateway API. There's 3 different personas. There's a persona that is the cluster admin, the infrastructure provider. There's the controller author, and then there's the end user that owns their applications, right? And from the perspective of an end user, this largely works the same way. Reference grant looks very similar, but we're adding new concepts to enable that kind of controller level authorization as well.
Right. Yeah. I'll just look at the GEP then. Or CAP.
Cool. And yeah, maybe then we can take a step back. Candace, you had a comment on the previous one?
Yes, I was just wondering, I mean, as you started talking more about Arcos GEP 91, what do you think is the difference between Arcos GEP and what you want to do with splitting up the backend TLS GEP, or you know what I mean? Because we were talking before this meeting, we were chatting before this meeting about client cert being, the main motivation for splitting that. So if you're going to be splitting client cert and making that an extension of the backend TLS policy, how is that different than what Arco is working on here? And if it's very different, then we should, as you mentioned, figure out a different name, a little less generic name than client validation.
Yeah, no, I think I think you have some good diagrams in here, but maybe I'm confusing. But yeah, so basically what Arco's GEP is from client to gateway. Your GEP is gateway to backend. But specifically, your GEP is gateway to backend, the config that's attached to the backend. But there in the connection between gateway and backend, there's some config that lives at the gateway layer. And I'm suggesting that config that lives at the gateway layer should be a separate GEP, even though it's really referring to this connection, it's referring to the gateway side of that connection, roughly. And specifically the client cert it should use to connect to the backend. And Arco his GEP is talking about how the gateway can verify the cert that the client is presenting to it.
So I think the problem is we're using client in 2 places here. So we're talking, so the one that Rob was talking about earlier is the gateway as a client, when the gateway is a client. Arco's one is talking about when the gateway is a server and you want to be able to specify a CA for some external client to be able to connect to the gateway. And that's the difference, is where this config lives, right? Like if we're talking about configuring a client cert on the gateway for connections from the gateway to the backend, that is like gateway as client. And so like, that's not actually talking about client validation. That's why I think that's actually not that bad a name. And I also think that, so one of the things that's important is that this config lives in the listener. And so this is a per listener config. Whereas I think one of the things we need to discuss in any further GEP about the connection between the gateway and the backend is where that config lives. What level does it live at? When is it useful to have different things? I think that Dave asked in the chat, do we want the nodes for validation to be the same for client to gateway and gateway to backend? I think they should be similar. They're probably going to be similar because it's a roughly similar idea, but like it may not be the same because in the gateway case, you need to specify like at the very least a CA, and maybe you need to specify a full key pair, because that's what the gateway actually, the problem, whatever the gateway implementation, sorry, it's not necessarily a proxy, needs to connect to the backends correctly, and that will be a key pair. So that's another difference in that in the edge client case. Maybe that's the way to talk about it here, is a edge client versus backend client or something like that. In the edge client case, the gateway only needs to know the CA it should use to validate edge clients, whereas in the backend client case, the gateway needs to know the key pair that it needs to use to connect to the backend. So does that make sense, Candace?
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. But okay, so you think it's okay to use the term client validation for client, but
Off
I
the top
think
of my
then
head,
we
yes.
should definitely not use client validation for the case where we want the actual gateway client. Or actually
Yeah.
referring to the actual gateway
Yeah,
client.
I think the
And
most.
sorry,
Sorry,
just
go
let
ahead.
me go a little bit further. I think you're kind of shying away from the term MTLS, but that is what you're talking about, right?
It is what we're talking about, but like there's just, the term is so overloaded that that I don't like using it, right? Like, because some people will use it to mean like a service mesh magic to MTLS that involves no configuration and no sort of visibility to the end user. And so it is absolutely a mutual TLS authentication, 100% agreed. But using the term MTLS is too overloaded and carries a high likelihood of being misinterpreted. That's why I don't like using it.
Even in this case?
Yeah, I mean, like we can say MTLS if you want, but my experience with all of the other TLS stuff we've said is that every time we say MTLS, people are like, but what about service mesh? And it's like, this is not relevant here. I don't want the conversation to be distracted again with us needing to explain why this case is not service mesh. And so like that's why I don't like doing it. Look, and to be clear, I work on a service mesh. It's very important that MTLS is handled, but in this case, it's just using those 4 letters is like opens the conversation up to a lot of derailment, and that's why I try to be more specific about the terms. I'm sorry to be a jerk about it if I am being a jerk about it, but that's why I'm burned by a year or so of discussion.
Mhm. Okay, so I would just then like to echo Rob's concern that we find the right term for it. If we're going to use ARCO's term client validation in the client validation context, that we need to find the right term for it. And it's going to be kind of hard if we can't use like gateway client validation or MTLS. So
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, and I think the most likely use case here is that the config that we want from gateway to backend is just the client certificate. And so you could say client validation points this way and client certificate points this way, but even that's confusing. Like Nick kind of alluded to, the client cert attached to a gateway is probably not per listener, it's probably per gateway. And so that's a bit of a difference where like this config is per listener and this config is probably per gateway. Again, we haven't had the time to sketch this out yet. I feel like before we go too far and adding too many TLS pieces, we just kind of need that bigger overview of the picture we're working towards. Like just, not every fine-grained detail, but just the overall sketch of what we're trying to get to. So we understand the different pieces at play and we can have reasonable names for each of them that aren't going to just be confusing and overlapping, 6 months, a year from now, whatever.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
almost like we need a different name for the box that is labeled client in that diagram, perhaps user agent or similar. But yeah, anyway, let's talk about that other time. Naming is hard. Vinod?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to again agree with Candice in that I think mutual TLS and terms like client and mutual TLS are highly context sensitive in that it depends on what group you're talking to, right? If you're talking to
Yes.
service mesh guys, of course, they'll have their bias on what this term means versus, you talk to a bunch of otherwise ZTNA guys, for example, client is another very overloaded term. So I think if you use terms that the protocol itself disambiguates, it might be more of an industry standard term we can
Well, yeah.
need to get a definition of from somewhere, some RFC like document.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we absolutely should think about that. But to be honest, I think probably the right thing to do here is actually the more that I think about this, I spent like a minute thinking about it, but like, the more that I think about it, the box on the left needs a new name. That will really help disambiguate this, because there's a big difference between the gateway as a client and the client, right? Like, but we're using the same word, right? Like, and so something like, to steal from browser design user agent or something like that is like, is a bit more indicative in that we're talking about the thing that some end user is using to connect, or some other process is using to connect to a gateway. User agent is the closest I can come to, but like, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think peer certs, as Arco says in the thing, is a good name as well. That's what they are, the things that are connecting our peers. But yeah, anyway, I think that's one of the things we need to think about as we think more about this, is to give things a better name. And say, we all agree that we're going to call this thing user agent or client or something. Like, I'm happy for it not to be user agent, but like, yeah. And yeah. Yeah. Mike says Edge isn't used anywhere else and isn't banned. That is true, except for the other meaning that Edge has, which is a small cluster of computing that lives in a branch office or something like that, right? Like, it's another overloaded word. That's what I mean. Like, so that it could be better to steal words from RFCs, as Vinod says. The first thing I would like to put forward there is user agent, because it's a reasonably tightly defined thing in terms of access logs, and it says like, this is the thing that's doing the accessing. But I'm happy to sort of talk more about that, but I think that's probably going to be an important part of any discussion. I have not had a chance to have another review of Arco's PR since he made changes to it, and I really appreciate those changes, Arco. I will try and hit some bandwidth for that one this week.
Yeah, Arco, go ahead.
Thanks, Nick. So the only thing I'll add is the focus of this group is sort of gateway API. It's trying to replace Ingress. And the client here is the external client, right? It is the downstream client. So, I mean, it is what it is. And so we shouldn't shy away from it as well, right? So we're trying to do too many things, I guess, right? With this one API group. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Yeah.
Yeah, that's entirely fair. And I would say, if there's a term that we can use, I don't want to shy away from an obvious term, but if there is a term that we can use that isn't overloaded, because, but client very well could be the term, but I think it's worth running through RFC language and just seeing if there's another one out there. Maybe it's already been raised in this call, like Edge or whatever it happens to be. Yeah, I'm very, very open to that. And I also just wanted to mention, like, Arco, I haven't looked at huge detail in your GET, but what I've seen looks very promising, looks very reasonable. It just took me back to this idea of, I really need the bigger picture here. I really need to see how this all fits together. I know so far we've been so focused on, let's just do little pieces at a time, because that's easier to get across the line, and that's the correct thing to do. But we also, at least when it comes to TLS, need to have that kind of long-term vision of where we're headed. And this feels like an area where we're lacking that right now. And I can work with others on, developing what that is, not trying to, give a lot of detail, but just enough so we know the different pieces that we want to be configurable in this API, and hopefully what they might be called, just so that, we can work towards that. But I don't think like this is not meant to be any kind of critique of your GEP. I think your GEP is great. Just trying to, see the bigger picture here. Nick?
So I just had a thought that I just want to throw out there. See if anyone thinks it's a crazy one, but perhaps what we need is a sort of statement of intent memorandum gap that lays down what parts of TLS we're going to hit in what parts of Gateway API and what we should call those things. So, right, like a vision for TLS and Gateway API, here are the use cases we're going to cover. We can add to it later, but like, here are the use cases we're currently covering. Here's what we all agree that we're going to call these things. And that is then a memorandum gap that everything else that does TLS references. And that way we settle on the language, we do it once, we have a extended naming fight in comments. And as Dave says in the chat, there's an old doc that Candace wrote with use cases. We lift a bunch of that into that memorandum gap and talk about the use cases in that memorandum gap and say, this one is going to be dealt with, is going to be dealt with, and we're calling it this. And this one is going to be dealt with, and we're calling it this. This one is out of scope for whatever reason. Because I think one of the things that in talking about the original backend properties gap, one of the things that we found talking there is that I don't think there was not very much appetite for configuring like magic TLS, another MTLS, but yeah, like magic TLS that's done by the infrastructure without any user specific user requested configuration. So it's probably good to sort of rule in some things and put them in and out of scope and say we have agreed, the community has agreed on this, 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 and this. And that should help us, and also agreeing on terminology should then help us be able to move forward on these things. I think Candace helped collect the things, and I started the doc. But will this new get 91? Let me think about that. I don't necessarily think so. I think it's a bit of work, but it's not that much work, right? Like it's I think as long as we can agree on what we call the structs in GEP 91 for now, it is experimental. We can rename them if we need to. Like as long as we have a reasonable confidence that naming is okay enough, then there's probably okay for it not to gate that one. But I think that we should not do any more TLS changes after GEP 91. We should not do any more TLS changes without sitting down and working through like a memorandum gap is my.
It is still experimental, so we can still do name changes, etc. I mean, it's not experimental, but it would be experimental if we let it through. But I would, I like kind of what Nick was saying, not that it necessarily needs to block, but I would like to have a picture in my head. Like we don't need to have everything filled out and completely agreed on in the memorandum gap, but I just want to have a direction that we're all focused on and agreeing towards with, details can still be figured out. And I agree with Nick. I don't think it's that much work. It's just, drawing the bigger
famous
picture.
last words.
Yeah. Fair point.
Yeah. But Michael notes in the chat, what about is client validation also client authentication? There is crossover into authentication, especially if you're going to use TLS handshake to handle JOT or like something like that. Like, so yes, 100% agreed that we should mention that in those things and say this is deferred, or we're not making a statement about this yet, or something like that. Like, well, here's what we are agreeing to work on. But yeah, I 100% agree. We should at least mention those things in there. But this is exactly the reason why we need to write that stuff down, because anytime you start talking about TLS, lots of these things come out at sort of download themselves into the discussion and make it hard to have more specific discussions. And so this is intended to be a place where we can have that. Like, literally, I came up with this like 3 minutes ago though. So right, like, please take it with a grain of salt, but it just feels like it feels like a memorandum gap here might be the way to go, because the reason for the memorandum gaps exist is to set the language that we all use to talk about things and set a common agreement on what we're working towards. That feels like what we need for TLS config in general to me. I'm happy to be, happy to have other people say, no, it's a terrible idea.
Cool. Okay, I think we're all agreeing here on next steps. Big thanks to Michael for raising that particularly problematic but good conversation starter about client authentication and how or if it overlaps here. If I missed any AIs or follow-ups, please don't hesitate to add them so we don't miss them in Zoom chat for very unfortunate reasons. Zoom chat is gone as soon as the meeting is gone. So yeah, please, anything that feels like it should be persisted, if you can add it to the agenda directly, would be appreciated. Yeah. Okay, well, with that, maybe we should move on. Let me move on to the next item, which is just a heads up. Michael added this PR, which is great and annoying at the same time. Great in that it is the perfect, correct conformance test that follows the spec completely. Annoying because it's tripped up a couple implementations, including my own, in terms of how it's actually implemented. But as far as I can tell, this conformance test matches the spec verbatim and is the desired behavior. And so I'm very glad that it exists or will exist soon. Thank you for adding this. But I just wanted to call this out because, yeah, this is going to trip up a lot of implementations, is my guess. So, it sounds like so far 3 of 4 that I know have tried. So just watch out for this one. Recommend trying it sooner than later. And I've been thinking, for GK at least, where we're thinking about how we can deploy this in a backwards compatible way, which is always fun. If others are also thinking about the same thing, it might be worth talking about ways. We have our own ideas, but if this is something that other implementations are also considering, how do we, offer some kind of compatibility mode with the previous way we did things or whatever it is. This may be a common thing in Gateway API. So yeah, that's something that I know GK's implementation is thinking about, but if others are, I'm happy to have a conversation about something more broad. Otherwise, we'll just do our own thing. But yeah, this is a great PR, a great conformance test, but just watch out for it if you are running conformance tests or plan to, because this could very well trip you up.
It's important to know that this is an extended conformance test, so you can just not support the feature until you're ready to. That should, like the fact that if we all agree it's correct and it's testing the behavior that it should, I think it's fine for the thing to merge, as long as it's an extended feature. And you just, if you don't support it, then don't opt in, right? Like you don't have to opt into an extended feature. I know everyone wants to, me too, but that means that opting into this, the fact that lots of implementations can't opt into this yet, doesn't mean that we've designed this wrong. Like this is a case where we need to do this to ensure that things behave exactly the way we say they do. But it is extended.
Yep. Cool.
Yeah, and
All right.
great. Well, I haven't had a chance to have a look at it already, but it looks extremely exhaustive, and I love that.
Yeah, I will just, I just have to highlight this test takes a while to even look at and understand, but I just really appreciate the comments in the YAML manifest directly of why this doesn't match, because you see the test results and you're like, wait, why doesn't that match? And you have to do all this like mental calculation, but no, there's already the comments. Oh yeah, that lines up, that line. Yeah. So thank you. Well written test. All right, with that, I think Nick, you're the last one up.
Yeah, just wanted to give a quick update on the policy attachment split. I had some time while I was traveling, spent some time isolated on a plane, time to work on the split out of a direct policy attachment and indirect policy attachment from the main policy attachment gap. There's a bit left to do, but I think I've broken the back of it now, and so it shouldn't take me that much longer to finish this off now. Basically now what I need to do is put the pattern that we've used in backend TLS policy for status into direct policy attachment as sort of the recommended way to do status for now. And, you know, I'm happy to take conversation about it, but given that that's what we've included in the one policy that is included in Gateway API, I feel like it's okay for us to recommend that. The intent here again is to just be very clear that the intent here is to be able to graduate direct policy attachment separately to inherited policy attachment. One thing that I do want to call out, because I know lots of people are doing, you know, policy attachment, Quadrant folks, I'm looking at you. I have made a slight change to what constitutes an inherited policy as part of making this change. The change is that before the title was literally inherited policy. It's all about the defaults and overrides. That's still kind of true, but one way I've changed the spec a little bit in part of this so that you don't have to have the defaults part to be setting a default. If you create a policy that attaches to a gateway and it's intended to set settings for HTTP routes, that is an inherited policy, even though you don't have a defaults or override section. And I think that's one of the things that was very ambiguous before. You know, and the reason for that is you have all this problem, the discoverability problems of any other inherited policy, regardless of like whether or not you have the specific stanzas. So I've updated the language there a bit as part of this. So yeah, when I open the PR, I'm more than happy to talk about it, but I just wanted to give you all a quick preview that is a change so that you can have a think about it so that when I open it, it's not completely new. I'll try and call that out in the commit message and in the PR sort of opening comment, but yeah, I think that's probably the biggest change as part of this. Yeah, so anyway, comments welcomed, but yeah, I'm hoping to actually open that PR sometime next week, but let's see. I've been on before.
Cool, awesome. Well, it's looking forward to seeing that one. Good to see some progress going forward here, and yet another gap or a portion of a gap that is moving out of experimental. So that'll be great.
Yeah. So again, the other idea here is that GEP 713 itself will sort of move to memorandum state, with the 2648 is a direct policy attachment and 2649 is inherited policy attachment. Sorry, and those two can then take their own slots. Yep. Yeah, I think 2649 inherited policy attachment will probably effectively need to be slot straight into experimental because that's effectively where it is. You know, but because it's a pattern, but not an API. But yeah, I'm hoping that should make it a bit more clear about where these things are actually at.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I think that's everything for this week. Any last comments or questions before we call it time? All right. Well, thanks everyone. We'll see you all, well, hopefully many of you at the earlier time slot next week. That's Tuesday if you're in Pacific time at 8 a.m. All right. Have a great one.